and having this conversation around powerful disruptions and what do we know about that. And so my hope is to highlight some of the research in this area, but also to make it personal, because the research basically says that this is a very personal, very practical also topic for all of us. One thing that I always think about is when I think about development, and even I think about the power of experience and disruptions in our development, is I think about this. There's a giant walnut tree in my neighbor's front yard that I don't think they enjoy as much as we enjoy, because we get to look at it from our house, but at their house, this giant walnut tree kind of covers their whole house, but it's this amazing tree. And when I look at that tree, I always think about that tree has DNA. It has certain wiring in it that kind of tells it how to grow, and that are things that are wired into the way it is. And at the same time, that tree has been shaped by its environment. It's been affected by its environment. It's not a human being, so we can't really talk about learning, but if we could, I think about the way that the wind affects that tree over time, given where it's planted. And I think about the people carving their names in the side of it, affecting the character of the tree, even as we interact with it. And that it is a unique combination of both its wiring and the environment that's around it. And I think in the same way, that's what we know about leader development related to experience, is that we do bring certain things, that personality matters, those things about us. As psychologists, when we describe personality, those are the traits that we have, the things that are very unlikely, according to research, to change about us over our lifetime, but that's only a portion of our developmental story. That the rest of the story is about what happens experientially, and that disruptions play a huge role in that. My younger son Ryan is about to head off to college in August. We'll be moving him down to San Diego from Seattle, and it's been an interesting season. You can imagine, those of you who have kids in school, and what it's been like for the last year and a half. And one of the things that happened to Ryan during this season is that he took a job at Safeway. And if you aren't from the Pacific Northwest, Safeway is a grocery store chain, and so he got a job as I think they call it a hospitality clerk, which is basically a bagger, and does where he's dealing with carts or different kinds of things. And he's had some really interesting experiences at Safeway. And I think one of the things that's interesting, you may not see these as disruptions, but they were kind of a disruption to, he was home, he was a student, he's hanging out with friends sometimes, he's gaming virtually, and then all of a sudden he gets this job. And one of the things that happened on his first day of work, it was he went up to his manager because he couldn't figure out what to do. And the man, he said, "So I'm just trying to figure out, I've got some space and time. I'm not sure what should I go do." And this is the first day on the job. And the manager says, this is literally what his manager said. He said, "Well, you can either kick yourself in the head or you can go fluff the chip bags." And I tell you that story because ever since then, when Ryan comes home from work, we're like, "Ryan, tell us work stories." Because I think about, like, this is one of his early exposures to a manager. And this manager is not a bad guy. It was just a funny little, what he said was that he actually said it this way. He said, I'm 40 years old and I'm working at Safeway. And so you can either fluff the chip bags or you can kick yourself in the head. I was thinking to myself, so it's interesting because I think one of the things that Ryan was learned in that was like, I'm not going to talk to a person that way if I'm the manager. But the other thing that was, he just had so many experiences that are shaping him. And as I think about Ryan, I think about that walnut tree. I think about my son going off to college after a season like what we've been through with COVID. And he's about to, enter into a college atmosphere where things are beginning to open up now, and hopefully will be opened up. And I imagine if there's one thing that I know is coming for my son, it is a bunch of wonderful experiences, and also it's going to be a bunch of disruptions. And one of the things I think about also is, even in these moments before he goes off to college, is what can I do to better prepare him for what those disruptions might look like. what some of those those powerful experiences will be like. So I want to ask you a question, and get out if you have whatever you take notes on, maybe there's a couple things I'd love for you to take notes on, even as you enter into these conversations in just a moment. But I want to ask you a couple of questions. Think about this. What is one of the greatest disruptions of your life that has had a lasting impact on your approach to leadership? What is one of the greatest disruptions of your life that's had a lasting impact on your approach to leadership? And then here's another question. So just probably something comes to mind. I'm going to tell you a couple of mine in just a moment, but just make a note. What is one of the greatest disruptions? And I think what's interesting too is for some of you, some of those disruptions are actually hard to even write down. They're challenging to actually face. But I think, and so you make the choice about what disruption you would like to think about. And I bet that some of them are small, some of them are really slight disruptions, some of them are massive disruptions. And I want to give you permission to pick whichever you want. It may be one of those, like, it just be a moment, it could be a conversation, or it could be something that was much, much more disruptive. Some of those things are more like aha moments where it's like, oh wow. Or they were moments where it felt more like a deep, deep personal challenge. Some of them may have been episodic. They may have been like they occurred in an episode, or they may have been long-term experience. So you actually think about a disruption over multiple years for some of you, or it might be weeks or days. And then so I want to ask you a follow-up question as you think about one of those disruptions you faced. And it also, by the way, caused me to think about the difference between an eruption and interruption and a disruption. And one of the things I think that I discovered in that process is that an eruption is something that just kind of happens. It's outside of, it's not with intention. It just sort of something erupted. An interruption is an intentional disruption. And that the disruptions we face sometimes are eruptions, or sometimes they are intentional interruptions of what's going on. But I want to ask you the follow-up question. So I said that it has a lasting impact on your approach to leadership. This is disruption. It may have been personal, it may have been related to work. Write one thing down in answer to this question. What did that disruption teach you? Or another way to say it, what did you learn from it? What is one thing that disruption taught you, and what did you learn from it? And I have two more questions, as if that wasn't interesting enough to think about for each of us. This question is a little tougher. What is it about you that allowed you to learn from that experience? What is it specifically about you that allowed you to pull the lessons out of that experience? And then the last thing is this: what is it about the disruption itself? What are the characteristics of that disruption that made it so powerful? So let me give you a couple of examples for those of you that are thinking about your own journey in my own experience. One of the small disruptions, and I will tell you that as I was asking those questions, when I thought about this and I think about this, there are things that I will not share with you. And it's not because I fear vulnerability. A lot of it, sometimes it's because I walk in solidarity with another person for whom that story would connect something that I don't have permission to share. In some cases, it's things that are deeply there. They are part of my story, and it would require more time for me to fully unpack what that means to me. And I think, not that I'm afraid that you will misinterpret it, but that you might, and that's not my intention. And so but I did pick some stories. One of them is this. This is a small one. Was I realized that when I think about my career, one of the first times that I realized that leading is different from not was when I played 4 years of college tennis. And so in my senior year, I played as a peer with 10 other players on the team. The next year I became the men's tennis coach at that same university. The position vacated. I had done a lot of teaching of tennis as well as playing. And so somehow they, by some miracle, gave me the job. And what struck me in the very first practice was when peers of mine called me coach. And some of those guys on that team to this day would call me coach. And it was so this salient moment where I was like, oh, this is different. These folks, that I used to have this role where I would be the same one cracking jokes in the hotel rooms where we would travel, go on the road. Now I'm responsible. So I got to step back from that. I have a different way of showing up in this, and I need to figure that out. Another experience early in career, and it is interesting because some of the most powerful experiences people have thought about in the research are related to earlier kinds of job experiences, but they're not the only ones. But one of my other ones was early on. There was a professor that I taught with. I got started teaching at the graduate level before I had any business doing that, and I was working with graduate students, a lot of MBA students, and one of these other professors who was maybe 6 or 7 years older than me, so really not that much older, but at the time felt way older. She would say to me almost weekly. She would say, "Rob, what you really need to do is go out, go get your management lumps, and then come back and then teach." And at the time, I didn't have a lot of other contradictory voices to that. And I was deeply affected. It kind of made me question myself, because what I was thinking was, I'm spending most of my time, think about what she said, go get your management lumps and then come back and teach. I know what she meant, go get some experience and come back and teach. But what I was wrestling with was, I was dealing with MBA students who were sometimes much older than me. I was basically I felt called to help them deal with their lumps. And I thought, I don't have time. I don't have a second career to go out and get my lumps. And so I felt what I wanted to do was create architect learning spaces where I could help support those leaders as they're getting their own lumps. And by the way, other professor, I don't see my career as a thing about go get experience and get beat up and then you're able to teach. Like, I get it, but it wasn't the only voice I needed to hear. And then the other story is early in my career as well, is when I almost got fired from a job, and one of my key mentors was questioning what I was doing related to that. It wasn't like an ethical question. It was more about where my priorities were, because I was a professor and I was out there trying to do what I was teaching. And this early mentor of mine was a really, really hard conversation with 3 people I respected very, very deeply. And that was the last conversation I had with this particular mentor, who was 50 at the time. And the next day he had a stroke at work and died 2 days later. And what a powerful thing that was for me, to come face to face with the reality that the last conversation with this mentoring voice that I deeply loved, that my last conversation was that one, instead of something where he was proud of me. I know he was still proud of me. And I think one of the lessons I learned in that is, there's a long-term lesson about our place in people's lives. And also that I didn't always agree with him, and that I don't have to agree with all the mentoring voices in my life. So all those are just a few of the experiences. I've had ones more recently that were much more personal. But let me tell you a little bit about why those experiences are so important. And one of the things that some of you have heard me talk about before is that when I define a leader, I define it as a person, as this is the fundamental stripped down version of what a leader is, not qualified by certain things, that I define a leader as a person who goes first. And by the way, those of you who are saying, well, sometimes a leader goes second, I would say, yes, absolutely. And that is a going first action. And the reason why the going first part is important to this conversation is that the experience of going first creates all kinds of developmental challenges. And some of the research that was actually published back in there was a book that came out called The Lessons of Experience, if any of you want to grab it. There was a powerful connection between these experiences that we have, and so many of them were disruptions in the way that things were going. It was saying things were going a certain way, and now everything is going to be different now, or there's going to be slight changes in how I show up. And that somewhere between, I don't know if the percentages matter, but I can tell you it's somewhere between 70% and up of our development is occurring through these kinds of experiences. And that the lessons are there to be learned if we just paid attention. If we just paid a little bit of attention, that we could, but there was a common set of experiences that transformed people forever in terms of the way that they developed other people. Now, what's interesting is when I say transformed, I'm also, one of the important pieces of that is also that we continue to transform. So it's not the idea that I learned my lesson and now I have all the answers, but it's that I learned some lessons that I'm continuing to lean into with intention, with an openness to also continuing to become something different through different experiences. And some of you who have had multiple seasons in your leadership journey know what I'm talking about. Let me just give you some of those disruptive experiences. And Daniel mentioned this, but you do this work long enough, and I've had a chance to be a part of so many different longitudinal studies of leadership. I was a part of a study in aerospace that lasted for 6.5 years, where we followed a group of leaders, seeing whether or not we could actually replicate some of the original research that had been done in the 80s. And this research project started in like the year 2000 or so, seeing whether it would replicate for leaders in the aerospace industry. And then we ended up studying a group of nonprofit leaders and a group of leaders in ministry context. And then we studied engineering populations to see whether this common set of experiences would continue to emerge. And in fact, I'm telling you, it did. And Kim Armstrong, I just saw that comment. I can't help but do a nod to that, because we did that, right, Kim? And it's like, it was amazing to see that for leaders transitioning from engineering to leadership, that these common experiences emerge with some additions. So let me give you a few of those disruptive experiences from a leader development standpoint. And some of these will map onto some of the experiences you identify. Starting something from scratch. It doesn't mean you necessarily start a new job or you launch an organization from scratch. It could quite literally be sort of a smaller project with some of the things that people talked about. Turning around an organization. Those are disruptive experiences. Any of you who've had that experience. Good role models and bad role models. 1/3 of the time, the experience that people talked about related to role models, 1/3 of the time, they were bad role models. Meaning that if you're doing a horrible job as a leader, there is some good news. You're teaching someone something. Listen to this one, a career setback. A career setback was a very, very common in the research across all these populations of people. A powerful, powerful experience for people. A failure. So not just I got set back or something set me back, but I failed. And these were extreme failures that were very, very difficult. These were major disruptions for people. Deeply personal kinds of experiences. Some of you thought of personal experiences related to family or friends, or your community, or your own life, or your health, that affected the way that you lead. That was the reality. Changes in scope. Someone going from not managing to leading people, to leading 10 people, to upwards being responsible for 10,000 people in some of the research that we did. Or changes in financial scope, or even decreases in scope. Some of you I know, or whose faces I've seen today, actually experience right now this transition. I used to run an organization, 10,000 people, and now I'm an individual contributor. And that is a deep developmental moment for me. Leading alone was a powerful one. And one other one that emerged through some of our research was the idea of a renewed call. That one of the disruptions people experience was a renewal of that thing they feel called to and the people they feel called to serve. We know that those are the kinds of experiences that are so powerful for people to have. And one of the things I think that is interesting, that we've wrestled with, even as we've created tools and processes to support people, is that some of the experiences and disruptions are things that we wouldn't wish on people. That are just difficult for us to even take a look at and learn from, but so important if we're willing to do that. Now, there's all kinds of other things I can unpack around that are also important parts of this research in terms of people's developmental readiness and their learning agility, which is a different conversation. But I think it's important to note that one of the keys to unlocking the power of these disruptions is to invite people into their own efficacy and into their own developmental questions, and not to tell people what they should do, but to actually invite them into the questions that would develop their capacity to say, like, oh, I could learn from this, because so many people have so many scars sometimes that they're not able to maintain that openness and that feeling of agency in their own learning. And we know from the research that that's a critical component from pulling out all the competencies and skills that are necessary to learn. So here's just a couple of questions I want to give you as you go into these conversations. Maybe some of you want to talk about the most powerful disruptions that changed the way that you led forever, and maybe what you learned from that, what the impact of that has been. That'd be a great thing for maybe someone. Another conversation might be to think about what would change if every leader around you or within your sphere of influence were being invited to actively learn from the disruptive experiences that they're having. And then I want to also suggest this, that what would it look like if we created cultures where developmental disruption was a part of the water we swim in? Where what would that look like? And you all know that don't know me, that I that spent my life creating tools and a system for doing that. But even just to imagine what it would look like if we created cultures of developmental disruption, not for the sake of like beating people up, but maybe that part of our job would be to manage that pressure cooker of disruption to offer enough so people could learn and grow, but also be aware that sometimes we may need to offer them some stability as well. Because my final point is this: we cannot predict the disruptions that will come, but we do know that we can learn from them and we could lean from them if we leaned in. So I'm just excited for whatever it is that you all will launch into in these conversations we invest in each other.
Awesome. Thank you.